The day I got fined $15,000 for maintaining a dam I didn't even build, I honestly thought somebody had mixed up my file with somebody else's. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the envelope, reading the same paragraph 3 times because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. The letter came from a regional environmental agency, one of those offices that most people never think about until a government seal shows up in their mailbox. According to the notice, I was being penalized for operating and controlling a regulated water structure without proper authorization. That water structure happened to be an old dam sitting on the back edge of my property. Now here's the part that makes this story so ridiculous. I wasn't operating anything. I wasn't generating power. I wasn't selling water rights. I wasn't irrigating farmland. I wasn't making money from the pond. The only thing I had done for years was keep the old structure from falling apart. When I bought my property outside the small town of Millhaven, the pond was actually one of the biggest reasons I signed the papers. The place wasn't fancy. No giant house. No la que fuera una mansión. Just several acres of quiet land, a narrow creek, and a peaceful pond created decades earlier by a previous owner named God knows who. Every morning, I'd drink coffee on the back porch and watch deer come down to the water. Ducks nested there every spring. Herons visited during migration seasons. Sometimes local fishermen would stop on the county road, look across the water, and admire the scenery. It felt like one of those places that somehow escaped modern life. Of course, old structures need maintenance. Anybody who owns rural property knows that. Every spring after the snow melted, I'd walk down to the dam and spend a weekend clearing branches from the spillway, packing loose soil where runoff had caused minor erosion, and removing debris that could redirect water flow. Nothing major, nothing fancy, just basic upkeep. The kind of common-sense maintenance that keeps old infrastructure stable. For nearly 8 years, everything stayed peaceful. Then one summer the agency started conducting inspections on small private dams throughout the county. Apparently, they were reviewing aging water control structures and checking compliance records. At first, I didn't think much of it. A couple inspectors showed up one afternoon wearing reflective vests and carrying clipboards. They walked the embankment, took photographs, measured a few things, and asked simple questions. "How long have you owned the property?" one asked. "About 8 years," I said. "Did you build this dam?" "Nope." "Have you performed maintenance?" "Sure, basic maintenance. Just enough to keep it safe." They scribbled notes, thanked me for my time, and left. The entire interaction lasted maybe 30 minutes. I forgot about it almost immediately. Then a month later that letter arrived. Not a warning. Not a request for information. Not an invitation to discuss compliance options. A fine. $15,000. Just like that. I called the number listed on the notice, thinking there had to be some misunderstanding. The woman who answered sounded polite enough. I explained that the dam existed long before I purchased the property. I explained that my maintenance was purely preventative. I explained that if I stopped maintaining it, the structure would eventually deteriorate. There was a long pause on the line before she delivered the sentence that changed everything. If you're not the registered operator of the structure, you should not be conducting maintenance activities that influence its operation. I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "Wait," I said, "you're telling me that keeping the dam safe is considered controlling it?" Another pause. Maintenance activities may constitute operational influence under current regulations. That's bureaucratic language for yes. Suddenly, I understood the trap. For years, I've been acting like a responsible landowner. Now that same responsibility was being used as evidence against me. The safer I had tried to keep the dam, the more liability they claimed I had created for myself. I hung up the phone and stared out the window toward the pond. The water looked exactly the same as it always had. The ducks didn't know about permits. The deer didn't know about compliance classifications. The fish definitely didn't know about regulatory oversight. Yet somehow I had become the villain in a story where all I had done was prevent erosion. That evening I sat on the porch until sunset, replaying the conversation over and over in my head. Anger slowly gave way to something else, clarity. Because if maintaining the dam made me responsible for controlling it, then maybe the solution was surprisingly simple. Maybe I should stop maintaining it altogether. And that's exactly what I decided to do. Now, before we get back to the story, let me explain why situations like this make so many rural property owners crazy. According to standard procedure, government agencies aren't necessarily looking at what feels fair to the individual owner. They're looking at legal responsibility attached to the structure itself. From a legal perspective, once somebody actively maintains a dam, a pond, or another water control feature, regulators may view that person as exercising control over it, even if they never built it in the first place. The strange part is that common sense and legal definitions don't always line up. That's where people get blindsided. This is a psychological trap because most responsible owners assume that taking care of something reduces their risk. In everyday life, that's usually true. Fix your fence, maintain your roof, clear dangerous branches. But occasionally a regulatory system creates a situation where responsibility and liability start feeding each other. The lesson here is that understanding ownership and understanding legal responsibility are sometimes two completely different things, and if you don't know where that line is, you can end up paying for a problem you were actually trying to prevent. The next spring was the first time in nearly a decade that I didn't walk down to the dam with a shovel, work gloves, and a wheelbarrow. It felt strange at first. For years that routine had been automatic. Snow melted, water levels rose, and I'd spent a weekend making sure everything remained stable. This time I stayed home. I watched from a distance. The creek could do whatever the creek wanted to do. The dam could take care of itself. After all, I had been told very clearly that my involvement was the problem. If maintenance counted as operational control, then removing myself from the equation seemed like the safest legal decision possible. A few weeks later, my neighbor, an older rancher named Carl Bennett, stopped by while I was repairing a section of fence near the road. "You haven't been down at the pond lately," he said. I shrugged. "Government says I'm not supposed to be maintaining the dam." He stared at me for several seconds, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he laughed. "Well, that's one way to solve a problem." "Not my preferred solution," I replied. "But apparently it's the approved one." Carl shook his head and walked away muttering something about bureaucrats and common sense being natural enemies. By early summer, the first signs of change appeared. Small branches collected near the spillway. Normally, I would have removed them in 10 minutes. Instead, I left them exactly where they were. A few weeks later, heavy rain pushed additional debris against the blockage. Water began flowing around sections of the structure instead of through it. Nothing dramatic yet, just subtle changes. Tiny warning signs. The kind experienced property owners recognize immediately. I saw them. I understood them. And I deliberately did nothing. Every time I felt tempted to grab my tools, I remembered the $15,000 fine sitting on my desk. The irony was almost funny. For years I had worked for free to keep the dam safe. Now I was paying money to stop doing that work. As summer progressed, the region experienced one of the wettest seasons in recent memory. Storm after storm rolled through the valley. The creek swelled repeatedly. Water pressed against the aging embankment harder than it had in years. One afternoon, I walked down to observe conditions from a distance. Small channels had formed along the downstream face of the earth wall. Rainwater was finding weak spots and slowly carving paths through the soil. Under normal circumstances, I would have packed those areas immediately. Instead, I folded my arms and simply looked at them. The situation felt absurd. I wasn't watching a disaster unfold because I was lazy. I wasn't ignoring a problem because I didn't care. I was complying with the exact logic that had been used against me. A month later, another letter arrived from the agency. This one wasn't a fine. It was a follow-up notice regarding compliance status and future review schedules. Reading it felt like receiving maintenance instructions from someone who had already confiscated your toolbox. I remember setting the letter on the kitchen table and laughing out loud. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes frustration reaches a point where laughter becomes the only reasonable response. By late August, the pond level began dropping. At first, it was barely noticeable. Then the shoreline slowly retreated. Mud flats appeared near the edges where water had once covered the ground. Ducks started gathering elsewhere. Fish activity became less visible. The entire ecosystem that had depended on the pond was beginning to change. That part genuinely bothered me. Contrary to what some people might assume, I wasn't celebrating. I liked the pond. I enjoyed having it there. I had spent years protecting it. Watching it decline felt a little like watching an old friend become sick. But every problem unfolding in front of me traced directly back to the same question. If I touched the dam, would that be considered unauthorized control? Nobody seemed eager to answer that question in writing. Autumn arrived with another series of storms. The creek transformed from a gentle stream into a fast-moving ribbon of brown water. One evening, weather reports warned about severe rainfall throughout the watershed. I remember standing on the porch after dinner, looking toward the tree line where the pond sat hidden beyond the hill. Thunder rolled across the valley. Wind bent the tops of the pines. The air felt heavy and electric. Something about that night made me uneasy. Around midnight, the storm intensified. Rain hammered the roof. Water poured from the gutters. The creek was probably rising by the minute. Still, there wasn't much I could do. Even if I wanted to intervene, the conditions would have made any repair attempt dangerous. So I went to bed. Sometime before dawn, I woke to an unfamiliar sound. It wasn't loud enough to identify clearly, but it carried across the property through the rain. A deep rushing noise. Continuous. Powerful. Different. The next morning, I grabbed a jacket and headed toward the pond. Halfway there, I already knew what I was going to find. The sound reached me before the view did. Fast-moving water. Lots of it. When I stepped through the trees, the entire landscape had changed. A large section of the old earth wall had failed during the night. Water had punched through a weak area and rapidly expanded the breach. The pond was gone. Not reduced. Not damaged. Gone. What remained was a broad channel of flowing water, cutting through exposed mud, rocks, and flattened vegetation. The creek had reclaimed its original course. Decades of accumulated pond water had drained away in a matter of hours. I stood there for a long time taking in the scene. Part of me felt sad. Another part felt strangely relieved. The uncertainty was over. There was no longer a structure to maintain. No longer a permit issue to debate. No longer a question about who controlled what. Nature had made the final decision. Over the following weeks, the transformation continued. Wet grass spread across the former pond bottom. Native plants began appearing in areas that had been underwater for years. Birds adapted. Wildlife adjusted. The landscape wasn't dead. It was simply becoming something different. Then, almost predictably, the agency returned. 2 inspectors arrived on a gray morning, carrying clipboards remarkably similar to the ones I'd seen during their first visit. They walked the site, took photographs, and examined the channel where the breach had occurred. Their inspection lasted less than an hour. One of them eventually approached me. "Looks like the structure has failed," he said. "Looks that way." I answered. He nodded while reviewing his notes. Without a functioning dam, the creek has effectively returned to a natural state. I suppose it has. More notes, more photographs, more measurements. Then they left. Several weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was much shorter than the first. The report concluded that no regulated water control structure remained on the property. The waterway had been naturally restored. As a result, the previous enforcement action was no longer applicable. Just like that, the issue disappeared. No dramatic hearing. No courtroom battle. No public apology. The fine simply vanished because the thing they claimed I was controlling no longer existed. I remember reading that letter at the same kitchen table where the original penalty notice had shocked me months earlier. The contrast was incredible. In the beginning, they had treated me like an unauthorized operator managing a regulated structure. In the end, there was no structure left to regulate. The creek flowed freely through the valley exactly as it had before someone built a dam there generations ago. And the strangest part of all was that I never destroyed anything. I never hired contractors. I never brought in excavators. I never touched the dam after being told not to. I simply stepped aside and allowed nature to resume a job it had been trying to do for years. Looking back now, the part that surprises people the most isn't the fine, and it isn't even the fact that the dam eventually failed. It's the fact that I never set out to win anything. I wasn't trying to beat the government. I wasn't trying to prove a political point. I wasn't looking for revenge. Honestly, I just wanted to keep a peaceful little pond on my property. That's what makes the whole situation so strange. For years I thought I was doing the responsible thing. If I saw erosion, I fixed it. If debris blocked the spillway, I cleared it. If water started cutting a new channel, I reinforced the area before it became dangerous. That's what most property owners would do. Most people are taught that responsibility means taking care of the things under your control. Then suddenly I found myself in a system where responsibility and liability were pulling in opposite directions. The more responsible I acted, the more exposure I seemed to create for myself. From a legal perspective, I understand the logic regulators were following. Their job is to identify who is influencing a water control structure and ensure that structure meets safety standards. I don't think anyone at the agency woke up that morning hoping to destroy a pond or punish a landowner who was trying to do the right thing. But this story is a reminder that rules created with good intentions can sometimes produce outcomes nobody actually wants. The pond disappeared. Wildlife habitats changed. A structure that had remained stable for decades was lost. Meanwhile, the original objective, ensuring proper compliance, technically succeeded. That's where things get complicated. According to standard procedure, agencies focus on reducing risk. But people on the ground often focus on practical outcomes. Sometimes those two goals align perfectly. Sometimes they don't. This is a psychological trap that shows up in all kinds of systems, not just environmental regulations. People assume that if they contribute positively, they'll be rewarded. Then they discover that certain systems measure responsibility differently than common sense does. When that happens, frustration builds because people feel like they're being punished for helping. I think that's why this story resonates with so many property owners. Most of us can imagine ourselves standing in that exact situation, trying to understand how maintaining something safely somehow became evidence of control. At the same time, I don't think the lesson here is that regulations are bad or that oversight shouldn't exist. Old dams can absolutely create serious safety issues. Water infrastructure affects ecosystems, downstream properties, and public resources. Some level of oversight is necessary. The real lesson here is that regulations work best when they encourage cooperation rather than discourage it. If the people maintaining aging structures become afraid to touch them, the long-term results may end up creating bigger problems than the ones regulators were trying to solve in the first place. The lesson here is that incentives matter. People generally move toward behaviors that are rewarded and away from behaviors that are punished. When a system accidentally punishes voluntary stewardship, it shouldn't be surprising when stewardship disappears. That's exactly what happened in my case. Once maintaining the dam became a legal risk, stepping away became the safest option available. Nature handled the rest. Even now, when I walk out behind the property, I sometimes stop where the pond used to be. The landscape looks completely different. The creek winds through tall grass and exposed stone. New plants have taken root. Birds still visit, just different species and life adapted as it always does. And every now and then, I catch myself wondering what would have happened if that first conversation had gone different. Maybe a permanent solution could have been found. Maybe the pond would still be there. Maybe none of this would have happened at all. But that's not the story. The story is that a man tried to maintain an old dam, got fined for maintaining it, stopped maintaining it, and eventually watched nature eliminate the problem altogether. If you've made it this far, let me know what you think in comments. Was the agency simply following the law? Was the outcome unavoidable? Should landowners be encouraged to maintain inherited structures? Or should responsibility automatically transfer when they buy the property? I'm genuinely curious where you stand because stories like this sit right in that uncomfortable gray area where law, common sense, environmental policy, and human behavior all collide. And sometimes those collisions create consequences nobody sees coming until the water starts flowing in a completely different direction.